It has now been 1 year since the apparent discovery of graves found in the Kamloops residential school, the former grounds. But has this story ever really been verified? Is Canada really guilty of committing genocide? I'm Candice Malcolm, and this is The Candice Malcolm Show. So 1 year ago, on May 27th, 2021, the Kamloops Indian Residential Band released a bombshell of a press release with a stunning accusation. This accusation made its way around the world. The band claimed that it had used ground-penetrating radar to detect the remains of 215 children who were said to have died while attending the local residential school. Now, this statement, which was issued by an unknown First Nations politician, it was rather amateur in the way it was written. It was void of any facts or evidence. It was heavily built on emotion and quotes from elders who were passing on oral knowledge. It had a catastrophic impact on our country. This one statement sent off a whirlwind of events. It led to exaggerated headlines, erroneous claims of mass graves, accusations of genocide, international shame and contrition from Canadian leaders, more discoveries from other bands, sort of look-alike claims, genuine remorse and concern and sadness from Canadians all across the country, and eager progressive politicians who began competing over who could use the most hyperbolic and anti-Canadian rhetoric. It's not an exaggeration to say that this spurred an existential crisis among Canada's elites. Their whole narrative about Canada being a kinder and gentler, more progressive version of America, well, that all came crashing down with their own hyperbole and self-flagellation. Their whole worldview came crashing down. They tried to cancel Canada Day. They excused away the burning of churches and the toppling of statues, and they tried to force this as a major issue in the past 2021 federal election. In fact, during the English debate of the 2021 federal election, reconciliation with First Nations community was the most prominent topic discussed. And that wasn't organic. It was because of the organizers' themed approach to the debate. They mandated that the topic received the lion's share of discussion. So in a debate about the most pressing issues facing Canada, the discussion on reconciliation lasted for 27 minutes. They spent 27 minutes of a 2-hour debate talking about reconciliation. Now, by comparison, during that election, a Leger survey that was done with the National Post found that First Nations reconciliation and that issue didn't even crack the top 10 issues that Canadians were focused on during the election. Canadians were focused on the cost of living. They were focused on increased funding for healthcare. They were focused on the post-pandemic economic recovery and managing the pandemic. Those were the top 4 issues. And instead, we spent 1/4 of the debate talking about reconciliation with First Nations. Elites try to force that conversation onto us, and that remains their obsession and their purpose. They try to force this conversation, even though the details of that original story remain spurious and unverified. And so I want to go back to the original story and talk about what we know, what has been verified, what facts are out there, and what remains just vague and unknown. And so joining me to have this discussion I'm very pleased to be joined by Professor Tom Flanagan. Tom is a professor emeritus at the University of Calgary School of Public Policy. He served as the campaign manager to Stephen Harper's Canadian Alliance leadership campaign, and again on Harper's Conservative Party leadership campaign. He is an award-winning author specializing in Canadian politics and Indigenous rights. So, Tom, thank you so much for joining the show. It's great to have you back.
Well, nice to be here, Candice.
So let's start with the original claim, the story that came out just about a year ago now, that 215 children's bodies had been discovered at a residential school. Has there been any new developments, any new facts that we should know about from this story? What is the latest?
Well, nothing that you could call a fact. It's really important to understand what happened on May 27th. The chief of the Kamloops Indian Band gave a press conference. In the press conference, she talked about the findings of ground-penetrating radar, which had been conducted by an anthropologist from Simon Fraser University. The anthropologist's report was never made public. In fact, the Department of Anthropology at Simon Fraser refused to make the report public. they said it was just between the anthropologist and the Kamloops Indian Band, which in a business sense was true, that the Kamloops Indian Band had paid for it. But it's really unusual to make public claims based on a scientific report which you refuse to release to the public. So that's the first thing. Secondly, the anthropologist did later clarify that no human remains had been found. What she found was she originally said 215 potential burial sites. These were disturbed earth. Later, the number was reduced to 200, but that's not a significant difference here. That's what ground penetrating radar could do. It can show that the earth has been disturbed, but you don't know what's there unless you excavate. Now, it's not surprising that the earth would have been disturbed in this area because it was an apple orchard, so trees had been planted there at one time. Trees don't grow naturally in British Columbia, so they had to be planted. So there had to have been soil disturbances taking place. There has been no excavation there. So to this point, there is not a single piece of concrete evidence that anybody is buried in these sites, let alone children from the Kamloops Indian Residential School. So, I mean, this is the greatest fake news story in Canadian history. There's absolutely no evidence for what's been claimed, and yet the story has gone around the world several times, as you pointed out in your opening remarks.
Well, it's really interesting that that there was no demand for evidence, that this press release was sent out. I remember reading it over and over again, trying to figure out the facts that you would see in the Washington Post or the CBC or the Globe and Mail. They weren't from a report, as you said, because the report wasn't published. It was all based on quotes from people who had their own recollection of things that happened. So it didn't seem like the standard that we would usually apply to news stories what was taken into consideration at all. They just sort of ran with the most hyperbolic aspects of it and used that to basically condemn Canada as an evil genocidal state. I'm just wondering, if you can comment on why you think that the media was so sort of quick to jump on the story, why there wasn't any verifying of facts, why they didn't ask for more evidence, and sort of, why this story took on a life of its own.
Yeah, well, there are several background factors here that help to explain how this story could gather so much momentum so quickly. First of all, it played to an existing narrative. The narrative had already been established over, let's say about 30 years previously, ever since Phil Fontaine made his famous interview with Barbara Frum in 1990. The story has been built that the residential schools were evil places where students were deprived of their language and culture, and in fact even tortured and killed. So there had been lots of oral testimony to this in this direction over a period of many years. So the media were primed to report what they thought or what they heard to be physical evidence of this pre-existing narrative. So when something plays into an existing media narrative, it's bound to get uncritical coverage, and that's exactly what it did get. Secondly, at a more technical level, one of the major thrusts of Aboriginal ideology in the last, again, approximately maybe 30 to 40 years, has been reliance on oral testimony. And this is not just having to do with claims about unmarked graves, but this has been a major trend in treaty interpretation as well, that the treaties don't necessarily mean what the treaty text says it means, but that they have to be interpreted in the light of memories. But of course, nobody's alive today who was alive when the treaties were negotiated. So what you typically get is something along the lines of, this is what I heard from my grandfather. is what the treaty meant, which is often contrary to the explicit wording of the treaty. So you have oral testimonies from elders, so-called elders at the Kamloops Indian Band, talking about not necessarily their own experiences at the school, but what they claim to have heard from others about things that took place at the school. But that fits into the notion of traditional oral testimony, which has become quite crucial in the world of Indigenous politics. So there's another factor that helps to explain how this story could gather so much momentum so quickly.
One of the things that you and some of your colleagues who've taken an interest in researching and bringing some more truth to light, some facts to light, is just information about this school, the Kamloops Indian Residential School. You had a recent piece in True North talking about how they had this sort of world-class Olympic swimming pool. You found archive photos of children sort of carefree, playing, happy. A lot of these pictures came from our friend Chris Champion over at Dorchester Review, the publisher over at Dorchester Review. And it seemed, as well as firsthand accounts of individuals who had gone to that school, people who had transferred to that school, people who had taught at that school, including many First Nations people who taught at that school, that really seemed to show a very different perception of the school. You know, it shows children looking happy, healthy, enjoying a variety of activities. This doesn't really seem to reconcile with the sort of overly negative doom and gloom. These schools were death camps that were murdering children. So well, first of all, thank you for unearthing that and publishing it through True North. But again, do you think that these pieces of evidence that sort of punch holes in the narrative will have any impact in sort of changing the conversation? And if not, why do you think that these sort of powerful pieces of historical documentation don't impact the conversation on this topic?
Yeah, well, first of all, as far as some of the evidence goes, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission published a list of 51 children whom it alleges to have died at the school. That's over a period of more than 100 years. Not 215, 51. Now, of those 51, a majority have death certificates in the British Columbia archives, which are available to the public, although the TRC didn't bother to check on this source of information. And what the death certificates show is that the children died for, sort of normal causes. A few were runaways who suffered accidents. Majority died of, kind of ordinary diseases of the day, such as tuberculosis. And they were buried typically at their home reserves. Children came to that school from all over British Columbia, and it's a big province. It wasn't always feasible to send the body back, but most of them were sent back to the home reserve where they were buried. So there was nothing secretive or mysterious about these deaths. I mean, every death is sad, but people do die, and particularly in an age before antibiotics, diseases like tuberculosis and typhus were epidemic killers. There's a lot of evidence that as you said, the Kamloops Residential School was, all things considered, not a bad place. There's, they had their own swimming pool, large swimming pool, at a time when that was very unusual for a school to have a swimming pool, any kind of a school, in the 1950s. There's many pictures of children playing in the pool or otherwise enjoying sports and recreation. They look like happy, healthy kids. They're well fed, they're well nourished. We have the testimony of prominent people who attended there, like Len Marchand, first Indian member of the federal cabinet, political liberal, who said it was a pretty good place. They said the potatoes were sometimes kind of watery, but overall it was pretty good. As you correctly point out, some of the teachers were Indians. They were graduates of that school. Majority of the overall staff members were Native Americans. I mean, there are many jobs. These schools were major centers of employment for First Nations people. So because they had janitors, they had dorm supervisors, they had secretaries, on and on. And majority of these people were First Nations. So there's all kinds of his evidence that a historian would regard as the typical stuff of history, showing that while the schools maybe were not perfect, that they weren't charnel houses where children were slaughtered. So I come back to my point about how a story plays to an ideological preconception. It becomes truer than true. It doesn't require any evidence in the minds of media reporters, who for the most part are not trained historians, are not trained to evaluate evidence. They work under deadlines. They get some facts. They put it together, and they run with it. And so they tend to run with something that fits their preconceptions. And there's been so much priming over the years as to what residential schools were like, so that this story takes on a life of its own. And if you read the coverage, many of the articles go way beyond what even the chief had announced. The chief said that she thought that she had found grave sites, but many of the stories claim that 215 human remains had been found, as if bodies had been excavated. There was nothing like that. But another journalistic practice is to base your story on what other journalists have written. I mean, at one time you'd go to the clippings file in the newspaper, the morgue, so to speak, and look at the stories. Well, now it's all on the internet. So a reporter reads one story, adds a couple of comments, passes it off as his own story. And so the same fallacies get repeated and repeated and repeated. And the more they're repeated, the more they come to seem true to people, because they're being repeated. Now, and of course, our prime minister was no help here, because he immediately jumped on the story. And 3 days afterwards, he announced that all the flags on federal buildings in Canada would be flown at half-mast until further notice. And in fact, they weren't put back to normal flying position until Veterans Day in November the 11th. So what's that? June, July, August, September, October. It's about 6 months of flying at half-mast. I mean, this is completely unprecedented in Canadian history, and all in the service of what? Of nothing, of no real discovery.
Well, I saw that with the use of the term mass graves, because of course mass graves usually conjure images of, shooting fields or killing fields, and Eastern Europe during the Second World War, or like Cambodia in the early 80s, not something that would happen at a Canadian school. And yet, that term was shuffled around. There were some corrections from more responsible media outlets, but other media outlets still use that term, mass graves. I wanted to ask you, because, okay, so if there were 50 confirmed reported deaths from the school, and then, we had this bombastic report saying 215, I mean, one of the first things you, as a researcher or a journalist, you would do is okay, who were these children? What are their names? Where were they from? Where are their families? Presumably the families would be distraught looking for their child. You'd send their child away to school, and then all of a sudden the child's gone. Just the whole premise of the idea that we could just throw around these numbers, and the 215 from the Kamloops Band was just the first one. We heard, I think it was 715 from a band in Saskatchewan, and then another 250 from another band in central British Columbia. And the numbers keep accumulating. I haven't even really kept track of all of the latest numbers, but it seems like every few weeks we still, to this day, a year later, we have reports from reserves saying that they too have found X number of buried children. I just wonder, from a research perspective, perhaps someone in the government or Truth and Reconciliation Commission, do they have a archive of lists? Like, who are these children? What are their names? Do we know this information? Is someone looking into it? Or again, why are we so quick to accept these large numbers without the first bit of evidence, which would be names and family records of who these children were?
Yeah. Okay, there are really three big pieces of mythology which come together to create this story. The first one is the so-called unmarked graves, which at this point we don't even know if they're burial sites; they're soil disturbances. Secondly, there's the legend of the missing children, and this is a huge source of confusion. Yes, there were children who died at school, which is sad, and there were children who died at home too. That was sad. I mean, a lot of children died until the discovery of antibiotics because these diseases that were brought in from the old world were particularly lethal for First Nations populations that did not have inherited any kind of inherited resistance to them. So yeah, a lot of children died, but that doesn't mean that they're missing. Yeah, maybe they're missed. It's parents always, of course, miss a child that they've lost, but missing implies that nobody knows what happened. Now, these children are listed in records like the diaries of those who ran the schools, although many of these you can't get access to. I mean, for example, there's a document called the Codex Historicus for the Kamloops Indian Residential School, which is in the archives in the Provincial Museum in Vancouver, but it's, sorry, is that in Vancouver or Victoria? I can't remember which. Anyway, one of those major BC cities, but nobody can get access to that. The facility's been closed, and they're not making copies of documents for researchers, and so sadly there are dead children, but they're not really missing. Now, the TRC threw around at various times numbers of thousands of missing children, but it's never clear exactly who these kids were. It's a mix of kids who may have died at school, kids who may have died at home, statistical artifacts that arise from inadequate comparison of records, failing to consult birth certificates. It's a real hodgepodge. I mean, just to give you one example, if you remember the name Helen Betty Osborne, teenage Cree girl who was killed in Manitoba decades ago, she's listed as a residential school fatality in Manitoba. Well, she wasn't living in a residential school at the time that she was killed. There's many cases of that type. So these, but the TRC made matters worse by referring to, not just 3,000 or 4,000 missing children, but 15 or 25,000. Numbers with absolutely no basis in evidence. And then the third mythical pillar of this story is the idea that all Indian children were forced to attend these schools. I mean, only a minority of Indian children ever went to a residential school. There were more who went to day schools on reserves than to residential schools. And there was a large number who never went to any school at all up until, as late as the 1940s. A plurality of Indian children appear not to have been in any kind of school. So, yeah, residential schools were a reality, but they weren't the dominant reality of the First Nations childhood experience. And the records of the federal government are clear that for decades after they started funding residential schools, there was no compulsion to attend. Sometimes it was recommended to parents, but they weren't required to send their children to residential school. There wasn't anything like compulsory attendance until, well, the late after World War II, when the welfare state started to expand into the world of Indian reserves, and that led to a lot of family breakdown. It's a long story, but there was an infusion of cash, and Alcohol became traded on reserves, and there was a lot of family breakdown. And for several decades, the residential schools served like orphanages for children that were believed to be in danger or neglected. So at that sort of late date, yes, there were children that, because there was no provincial mechanism for dealing with Indian children at that point, provinces didn't get legal authority to deal with children on reserves until much later. So there was a period of several decades when children that at a later date might have been taken into care by provincial governments were sent to residential schools. But that's a later piece of the story, and only a small piece overall. So you have these interlocking bits of mythology of unmarked graves, missing children, forced to attend, and then they all come together into this story about Canada's not only a cultural genocide, but maybe even a physical genocide of First Nations people. And it's not supported by evidence, but it plays to ideological preconceptions about progressive ideology, about the role of so-called white supremacy and colonialism and mistreatment of everybody except white people. And so you got this receptive ideology that's just waiting there for some semblance of proof, which of course in this case is not proof at all, but it's packaged to look like proof. And then it's seized upon then by journalists and politicians.
Well, it's tremendous the impact that it's had on our country over the past year. I think they've done a tremendous disservice to First Nations people because I can't imagine how you can carry on living a normal life or consider your own future and building a life for yourself in a country when you're told to believe that that people that the people who run Canada are genocidal white supremacists who are trying to kill you, basically, or eliminate your entire race. I think it's such a disservice to First Nations people. But Tom, I'm wondering if you can tell us a little bit about what you think should be done at this point, because I know in your piece that you wrote for True North, you said that there must be an excavation. We need to sort of put this issue to rest. I'm wondering how sensibly minded Canadians can counter this really damaging narrative, what we can do to push back against it, and from a public policy perspective, what do you think can be done to not only move past this chapter, but also help to raise the fortunes of First Nations people and enable them to have good lives in Canada?
Well, I'm trying to do my little bit by writing about it. You might say I'm trying to expose fake news in True North. I hope you'll appreciate the sly humor there. But no, seriously, I and friends are writing about this as much as we can, hoping to create a body of literature that, even if it doesn't have a lot of impact immediately, will be there for the future. Secondly, there need to be excavations to test the theory, but not just any excavations. There's a recent news report from the Saddle Hills for First Nation, Saddle Hill, Saddle Lake, which is it? Anyway, Saddle something in northeastern Alberta, which is where the Blue Quills residential school was located. And they've been digging, and they claim, according to CBC reports, to have found perhaps 200 plus skeletons. But first of all, there's no professional or RCMP supervision. It's just people digging, and they're digging in a cemetery. Now, it's not surprising that you're going to find burials in a cemetery. They claim to have found children's remains, but they also say that they've been reburying as they go. So there's no evidence that can be shown to the public. So this story has generated headlines about remains being found, but it's not the kind of evidence that any court or any serious scholar would accept as as evidence is just based on somebody's say-so about what they claim to have seen when they dug in a cemetery. According to the story that's circulating, the records of the Blue Quill School show, I think it was 22 children who died there. Whereas they say the records of the Catholic Church, I mean, and this was a common situation where you had a residential school, but you also had a parish church, and you had a common cemetery, and the cemetery was used by members of the reserve as well as by the residential school. So they claim Catholic Church records, which again, nobody is able to see. They claim that there were over 200 children died, but the story as originally reported said between the ages of 4 and I forget what the upper limit was. Well, children weren't admitted to residential school until they were 6. So if a 4-year-old died, it wouldn't have been at a residential school. So, this is all mixed up, and we don't even know if they're interpreting the church records properly, because at this time, most Catholic Church records were kept in Latin. And I've done some of my own family research. 19th century Irish immigrants, parish churches kept records in Latin. It's not that simple. There's a lot of abbreviations. I am a former altar boy who has studied Latin, and I can read it more or less. But when you're confronted with handwriting and abbreviations, and it's not that easy. So anyway, I'm sure there's going to be a lot of stories around the anniversary of Kamloops, but they have to be read very critically. So come back to your question about what should be done. Well, excavations above all, but properly supervised excavations in which the if not the RCMP, at least some kind of professional supervision is there. I mean, ideally it would be the RCMP, because the allegations are that these are crime scenes, that these are children who were murdered or died of neglect or abuse at the schools. Well, if that's true, it would be a crime scene, and there should be police supervision. But at the very least, there should be a professional supervision with the records made available to the public, not kept secret like the record of the original ground penetrating radar at the Kamloops. So I think that properly conducted excavations would be the way to go. But what I fear is going to happen is that we're going to get more and more amateur excavations like the one from the Blue Quill School that don't actually prove anything, but which are hyped in the media as here is the evidence, here is the remains. Well, if you dig in a cemetery, it's not unlikely that you're going to find human remains. That's what's in a cemetery. So I'm not too optimistic right now about excavations. Excavations properly carried out, yes, but I haven't seen any evidence yet of any of these excavations being properly carried out.
Well, it's such a good point. I just want to go back because the Kamloops First Nations was sort of the big first one, and then the next two, there was Cowessus in Saskatchewan and Lower Kootenay in British Columbia. Both of those two secondary ones, the unmarked graves were within existing cemeteries, and you did have people from the local communities coming out in the media saying, look, there's no discovery here. It was a graveyard. It shouldn't surprise anyone that there was graves in a graveyard. Someone else saying, look, this was a graveyard that serviced the entire community, not just the residential school. In fact, the one in Cranbrook in Lower Kootenay, the graveyard was attached to the church, which was attached to a hospital, and it predated the residential school by 100 years. So to your point that they're finding skeletons, it's like, well, this would have been a graveyard for the entire community and nothing to do with the residential school. So I think that's a really excellent point. Well, Tom, I really appreciate your time, and I appreciate all of the research and the work that you're doing to bring this really important issue to light. So thank you so much for your time, and thank you for your efforts on this.
If I could just toss in one more point about the unmarked graves. Graves may be unmarked today, but the common way of marking a grave on Indian Reserve was a white cross, a wooden cross. Now this is Canada. White crosses don't stand up very well to the Canadian winter. So, and we're talking in many cases about alleged burials that are decades or even more than a century old. Canada as a country is full of unmarked graves, not just of Indians, but of all kinds of people that were originally marked with a white cross, but over time that cross has disintegrated. So that's another aspect on this, that when they say unmarked graves, that may be the situation today, but that's not necessarily the situation. If it ever was a grave, there most likely was a wooden cross there to mark it.
Yeah, that's such an important point, such a nuanced point that I never saw reflected in the CBC or the Toronto Star or their coverage. So,
No, you
thanks for
won't.
making that point. Yeah, unfortunately. All right, Tom, thank you so much for your time. Great to have you on the show.
Okay, Candice, my pleasure. Bye-bye.
All right, that's Tom Flanagan. I'm Candice Malcolm, and this is The Candice Malcolm Show.